The Lantern on Blackwood Hill Part 1. Beginning. Arrival to first haunting. Long before Ravenbrook Village had paved roads, electricity, or even a proper map on most travelers' charts, there was already a mansion standing on the hill that overlooked the valley. The mansion had been built by the Blackwood family nearly a century earlier. In its early years, it had been a place of elegance and celebration. Wealthy guests traveled from distant towns to attend the lavish gatherings held inside its enormous ballroom. Lanterns lit the balconies, musicians played late into the night, and laughter drifted down the hill toward the quiet village below. But time has a way of changing even the grandest places. The music stopped, the guests disappeared, and the mansion slowly fell into silence. Now the people of Ravenbrook spoke of the house in whispers. They avoided looking at it when they walked through the valley, especially after sunset. Because every night, without fail, a single lantern burned outside the front door, and no one had lived there for 70 years. Rohan Verma had never heard of Ravenbrook. He had never heard of Blackwood Hill, and he certainly had never heard the stories about the lantern. Rohan lived a life that had little room for legends or ghost stories. His world was made of office buildings, late-night work shifts, and the endless glow of computer screens. For most of his life, his days had followed the same predictable routine. Wake up, go to work, return home exhausted, repeat. Which is why the letter that arrived one quiet Monday morning caught him completely off guard. It came from a law office in a place he didn't recognize. Inside the envelope was a short, formal message informing him that his grandfather had passed away. Rohan hadn't spoken to his grandfather in nearly 15 years. The old man had moved away from the family when Rohan was still young. No one ever explained exactly why. All Rohan knew was that the man had chosen to live alone in a remote village far from the city. The letter continued with another surprising piece of information. His grandfather had left him his entire property, a mansion, located on a hill above Ravenbrook Village, Blackwood House. At first, Rohan thought the letter had been sent to the wrong person, but the legal documents attached were very clear. The mansion now belonged to him. For several days he considered ignoring the whole thing. Selling the property without ever seeing it would have been the easiest solution. But curiosity has a strange power over people. Eventually, curiosity won. A week later, Rohan packed a small suitcase, rented a car, and began the long drive toward Ravenbrook. The journey took nearly 8 hours. The highway eventually turned into a narrow mountain road that twisted through thick forests and steep hills. The farther Rohan drove, the more isolated the landscape became. Cell phone signals disappeared. Gas stations became rare. And by the time the sun began setting behind the mountains, the road felt like it belonged to another era. When he finally reached Ravenbrook Village, the place looked smaller than he expected. Only a few quiet streets stretched between rows of modest houses. A grocery store stood near the center of town, its wooden sign creaking gently in the evening wind. Several villagers were standing outside when Rohan drove past. They all turned to look at his car. Their expressions were not welcoming. They looked concerned, almost worried. Rohan parked near the grocery store to ask for directions. The man behind the counter appeared to be in his late 70s. His hair was completely white, and deep wrinkles lined his face like old cracks in stone. When Rohan mentioned Blackwood Hill, the man stopped moving entirely. "You're going up there?" he asked slowly. "Yes," Rohan replied. "I inherited the place." The old man stared at him for a long moment. Then he sighed heavily. "That house should have been burned down years ago." Rohan smiled politely, assuming the comment was just another small-town superstition. "I'm sure it's just an old building." The man leaned closer across the counter. "Old buildings don't keep lanterns burning by themselves." Rohan didn't know how to respond. The shopkeeper eventually gave him directions to the hill road. As Rohan left the store, he noticed several villagers watching him quietly. No one said anything, but their expressions all carried the same silent message. Don't go there. The road leading to Blackwood Hill was barely visible from the village. It wound through thick trees and slowly climbed upward along the side of the mountain. The sky had already grown darker by the time Rohan reached the top. The mansion appeared suddenly as he rounded the final curve. For a moment, he actually slowed the car. Not because of the road, because of the house. Blackwood Mansion was enormous, much larger than he expected. Its tall stone walls rose above the trees like the remains of some forgotten fortress. The balconies hung crookedly along the upper floors, and several windows had shattered long ago. Yet, despite the decay, the building still carried an unmistakable sense of power. It looked like a place that once demanded attention. Now it simply watched the valley in silence. Rohan parked near the rusted iron gate and stepped out of the car. A cold wind swept down from the hilltop. He walked slowly toward the front entrance. And that's when he saw it. The lantern. It hung beside the door, exactly as the shopkeeper had described. Its warm yellow flame flickered quietly against the dark wood of the entrance. Someone had clearly lit it recently. Yet the entire property appeared completely abandoned. Rohan stood there for a moment staring at the lantern. Then he reached out and touched the metal frame. It was warm, very warm, as if it had been lit only minutes earlier. The inside of the mansion was even larger than it appeared from outside. Dust covered nearly everything. Antique furniture sat untouched in enormous rooms. Long hallways stretched in multiple directions, each lined with old family portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow Rohan as he passed. The silence inside the house felt heavy. Not peaceful, heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Rohan spent the rest of the evening exploring the mansion. There were dozens of rooms, guest bedrooms, a library, a massive ballroom with a cracked chandelier hanging from the ceiling, and a narrow staircase that led upward into a tall tower rising above the eastern side of the house. The tower door was locked. Rohan made a mental note to return later. Night fell quickly in the mountains. By the time Rohan finished exploring the first floor, darkness had completely swallowed the hill outside. The only light inside the mansion came from the lantern beside the front door. Its glow stretched across the entrance hall like a silent guard. Rohan eventually chose a bedroom on the second floor. The mattress was surprisingly intact after years of abandonment. He placed his suitcase beside the bed and tried to convince himself that everything about the house was perfectly normal. Old buildings made strange noises. Wind caused doors to shift, and villagers often exaggerated stories about abandoned places. Still, as he lay there staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the strange feeling that someone else was inside the mansion. Listening. Waiting. So, Rohan finally fell asleep sometime after midnight. But the quiet didn't last long. He woke suddenly. At first he didn't know why. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Dragging footsteps moving somewhere in the hallway outside his room. Rohan sat up in bed. The sound came again. Step. Pause. Step. Someone was walking through the mansion. But that was impossible. He grabbed his flashlight from the bedside table and walked toward the door. The hallway beyond was completely dark. The wooden floor creaked softly as he stepped out. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt strangely cold. Then he heard something else. A whisper. Soft. Barely louder than the wind outside. "Why did you come back?" Rohan turned quickly. No one stood behind him. But across the hallway, the dusty mirror hanging on the wall had begun to fog slowly. Letters appeared across the glass. As if written by an invisible finger, 2 words formed clearly in the condensation. Find him. Pasrnai. End of Part 1.
Part 2. The Voice in the House. Rohan stood in the dim hallway staring at the mirror. The words were still there. Find him. He blinked several times, hoping the letters would fade the way strange reflections sometimes did when the mind played tricks in the dark. But the condensation on the glass remained perfectly clear. The two words looked as if someone had written them moments earlier with their finger. Rohan slowly raised his hand and wiped the mirror with his sleeve. The letters disappeared instantly, leaving nothing behind except his own reflection staring back at him. For a long moment he remained there, standing in the silent hallway with the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Old houses, he whispered to himself. Just old houses. But deep inside, he knew something about the moment had felt wrong. Very wrong. He turned and walked back to his room, closing the door behind him. Sleep didn't return easily that night. Every creak of the wooden walls sounded louder than it should have. Every gust of wind felt like footsteps, and several times he could have sworn he heard someone walking slowly across the floor above him. Morning brought sunlight through the dusty windows, and with it came the comfort of normality. The mansion no longer felt threatening. It simply looked abandoned. The strange events of the night began to feel distant and almost ridiculous in the daylight. Rohan told himself the message on the mirror must have been caused by leftover moisture on the glass, reacting with the cold air of the hallway. Strange things happened in old houses. That was all. He spent the morning exploring the second floor more carefully. Several bedrooms were still filled with furniture covered in white sheets. The walls were decorated with faded wallpaper, and some of the old paintings still hung where the Blackwood family had placed them decades earlier. One portrait in particular caught his attention. It showed a young woman standing beside a balcony overlooking the valley. Her dark hair fell across her shoulders, and her expression carried a quiet sadness that the painter had somehow managed to capture perfectly. A small brass plate beneath the frame read, "Elena Blackwood, 1952. Rohan stared at the painting for a moment longer than he intended. There was something about her eyes. They looked almost alive, as if they were trying to say something. He eventually turned away and continued exploring. Later that afternoon, Rohan followed the forest trail behind the mansion again. The air felt warmer than the night before, and sunlight filtered gently through the tall pine trees. The lake appeared just as calm as it had the previous day, and once again, Annika was there. She sat on the same rock near the water's edge, her sketchbook resting against her knees. When she noticed him approaching, she smiled. "You survived your first night," she said lightly. Rohan laughed. "Barely." Annika closed her sketchbook. "You look like someone who didn't sleep very well." Rohan hesitated before answering. "I heard footsteps last night." Her smile faded slightly. "Inside the house?" "Yes." "Did you see anyone?" "No." Annika studied his expression carefully. Then she asked quietly, "Did you hear a voice?" Rohan felt a strange chill run down his spine. "How did you know that?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out across the lake where the wind was beginning to ripple the surface of the water. "People in the village have heard things like that before," she finally said. "Voices?" "Yes." "What kind of voices?" Annika took a slow breath. "The kind that ask questions." Rohan tried to laugh it off again. "Well, the voice in my house told me to find someone." Annika's eyes widened slightly. "What exactly did it say?" "Just 2 words." He paused. "Find him." For a moment, Annika didn't speak. The wind across the lake grew noticeably colder. Finally, she whispered something almost too quietly for Rohan to hear. "That's what she always says." The walk back to the mansion felt different that evening. The sky had begun turning orange as the sun lowered behind the mountains. But Rohan couldn't stop thinking about what Annika had said. "That's what she always says." The words echoed in his mind as he climbed the hill path. By the time he reached the front gate, the lantern beside the door had already been lit, just like the night before. The same steady flame, the same warm glow. and once again, no one was anywhere near it. Rohan slowly walked up the front steps. This time, he examined the lantern more closely. The metal frame looked old but well-maintained. The glass panels were clean, and the wick burned with a steady brightness that suggested it had been lit recently. But there were no footprints near the door. The dust on the porch remained undisturbed. No signs of anyone entering or leaving. Rohan opened the door and stepped inside. The mansion greeted him with the same heavy silence. That night, the house felt different. The quiet felt deeper, almost watchful. Rohan decided to explore the tower room. The narrow staircase leading upward creaked loudly beneath his weight. Cobwebs stretched across the corners of the steps, and the air grew colder with every level he climbed. At the top of the staircase stood the locked door he had noticed earlier. It took only a moment to force it open. The tower room was circular, with tall windows looking out across the valley. Dust floated through the air in the beam of Rohan's flashlight. An old rocking chair stood near the center of the room, and beside it sat a wooden chest. Rohan walked slowly toward the chest and lifted the lid. Inside, he found several folded letters and a diary. The cover was worn and faded with age. The name written inside the first page read, Elena Blackwood. Rohan sat in the rocking chair and began reading. The first entries described life in the mansion during the early 1950s. Elena wrote about the beauty of the valley, the quiet evenings beside the lake, and the loneliness she often felt inside the enormous house. Then the tone of the diary began to change. She wrote about someone named Daniel, a carpenter from the village. The entries described secret meetings by the lake, long walks through the forest, and the growing fear that her family would never allow their relationship. Several pages later, the writing became frantic. Daniel had disappeared. Elena believed her brother had something to do with it. The final entry ended abruptly with a single line. If they find out I know the truth, they will never let me leave this house. The rest of the pages were blank. Rohan closed the diary slowly. A cold breeze drifted through the tower windows. And then the rocking chair began to move, very gently, back and forth. Rohan froze. He hadn't touched it. The chair creaked softly as it rocked. Then a whisper drifted across the room. So faint he almost didn't hear it. Where is he? Rohan slowly stood up. The flashlight beam shook slightly in his hand as he turned toward the doorway. The room was empty. The whisper came again, this time closer. Where is he? Rohan rushed out of the tower room and down the staircase. Behind him, the rocking chair continued to move, back and forth, as if someone invisible was sitting in it. Outside, the lantern burned brighter than ever, and high above the mansion, a pale shape appeared for a brief moment in the tower window, watching the hill, watching the valley, waiting, still searching.